Celine sat at her small kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. The morning had begun like any other, with the soft hum of the city outside and the warmth of her cozy apartment wrapping around her. But as she swiped through her emails, one message caught her eye, a notice from her landlord. Her heart skipped a beat as she read it again. The email was brief and blunt, informing her that she had been evicted. No warning, no explanation. Just an ultimatum to vacate her apartment immediately. Selena's mind raced. She had always paid her rent on time, never caused trouble. Why was she being treated this way? Her thoughts spun as she stood up and paced across the room, trying to make sense of it. She had lived in this apartment for nearly 3 years. It wasn't just a place to stay. It was her safe space, the place where she had built her life after moving to the city. The place where she had spent countless nights planning her future, building her career, and finding peace after a difficult past. Now it seemed like all of that was about to be ripped away, without so much as a reason. She tried calling her landlord, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She left a message asking for clarification, but received no response. The next few days passed in a blur. Celine searched for any sign of why this was happening, digging through her lease agreement and speaking to neighbors who had lived in the building for years. No one had any answers. The landlord had suddenly become unreachable, and the building management office refused to give her any information. She felt like she was stuck in a nightmare, where the walls of her apartment closed in on her, and the world outside seemed cold and indifferent. Just when she thought she couldn't take the stress anymore, something strange happened. One afternoon, as Celine sat on the steps outside her building, trying to gather her thoughts, a man approached her. He was an older gentleman, wearing a worn jacket and carrying a stack of papers in his hands. His eyes were kind but filled with urgency. He introduced himself as Arthur, a longtime resident of the building. Without preamble, he asked if she was okay. Celine hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, but something about his demeanor made her feel like he wasn't just another stranger. She told him about the eviction notice, how she had been blindsided, and how she couldn't understand why her landlord had done this. Arthur listened quietly, then pulled a piece of paper from his stack. It was a copy of a letter, dated a few months ago, warning tenants about the building's new management and the changes that were coming. According to the letter, the landlord had been selling off properties, including the building where Celine lived. She stared at the letter, her heart pounding. This was the first piece of concrete evidence she had seen that something shady was going on. Arthur explained that the landlord had been facing financial trouble for a while. He had been evicting tenants at random to clear out the building and sell it to a developer who planned to turn it into luxury apartments. Celine felt a surge of anger mixed with disbelief. She had been a good tenant, paying her rent, keeping to herself, and taking care of the apartment. And now, she was being treated like disposable property. Arthur's voice broke through her thoughts as he continued. He told her that he had been in the building for over 15 years, and that the landlord had been slowly running it into the ground. Arthur had seen it all, the sudden rent hikes, the ignored maintenance requests, the empty promises, but now it seemed like the end was near. The eviction was just another step in the landlord's plan to get rid of everyone, making way for high-end condos that would push out the people who had lived there for years. Celine's mind whirled. Everything she thought she knew about her home, her sanctuary, was crumbling before her eyes. But Arthur wasn't done yet. He told her that he had been working with a group of tenants who were fighting back against the landlord's tactics. They had been gathering evidence, filing complaints, and reaching out to legal aid for help. He offered to connect her with them, to show her how to fight this injustice. For the first time in days, Celine felt a flicker of hope. She had been so caught up in the chaos of the eviction that she hadn't even thought about the possibility of standing up for herself. Over the next few days, Celine met with the group. They were a mix of people from different walks of life. Young professionals, retirees, single mothers, all facing the same unfair treatment. They shared stories of the landlord's manipulation, of being pressured to move out, of unreasonably high rent hikes. The group had been documenting everything from eviction notices to texts and emails from the landlord. They had even uncovered a few legal loopholes that could help them fight the eviction. With their guidance, Celine learned about her rights as a tenant. She began to understand how much power she had been giving away without realizing it. The day she finally decided to take action, Selena gathered all the evidence she had: photos of the eviction notice, the copy of the letter Arthur had shown her, and the testimonies of other tenants. She contacted a lawyer who specialized in housing disputes and explained everything. The lawyer was shocked by the landlord's behavior and assured her that with the evidence they had, they could take legal action. Celine felt a wave of determination wash over her. She was no longer the passive victim in this story. She was fighting back. The legal battle wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, times when Celine thought about giving up, but she kept going. The landlord tried to pressure her into settling for a small payout, but she refused. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had been wronged. After months of back and forth, the court ruled in her favor. The landlord was forced to cancel the eviction and pay a fine for violating tenant rights. Celine couldn't believe it when she heard the news. She had won, not just for herself, but for the entire building. With the eviction overturned, Celine was able to stay in her apartment, but the experience changed her forever. She realized that the world wasn't always kind or fair, but that didn't mean she had to accept it. She had learned that sometimes it took a stranger to show you the truth, and that standing up for yourself was the first step in reclaiming your power. She had gone from being blindsided by betrayal to becoming an advocate for her rights and the rights of others. And in the end, it wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about taking control of her own life, no matter the odds. As the days passed after the legal victory, Selena couldn't shake the feeling that the whole experience had awakened something inside her. She had always been a private person, content to mind her own business and avoid confrontation. But now, she realized how much power she had been ignoring in herself. The eviction, the betrayal by her landlord, it had forced her to confront things she'd been avoiding for years. Celine had grown used to being overlooked. For most of her life, she had kept her head down, worked hard, and hoped that would be enough. But the eviction had opened her eyes to a new reality, one where silence and compliance didn't always lead to the best outcome. The support from the tenant group and the guidance they had given her had opened doors she didn't even know existed. She had never imagined she would be someone who would take a stand, but now she was beginning to see the importance of community. The group had become her lifeline. They had not only helped her fight the eviction, but had shown her the power of solidarity. Together, they had been able to take on a system that was stacked against them. And through it all, Celine had learned the value of speaking up, of not letting herself be silenced by fear or uncertainty. But even with the legal battle behind her, things weren't exactly easy. The landlord, though defeated in court, was far from giving up. He continued to send threatening messages, claiming that Celine had ruined everything for him. At first, she was shaken by his relentless bitterness, but she soon realized that his threats meant nothing. He was the one who had made the choices that led to this point, and now he had to deal with the consequences. As the messages came in, Selena simply ignored them, focusing instead on her own future and what she could do next. It was around this time that she began to feel more at peace with her living situation. The apartment, once a place of stress and uncertainty, now felt like a symbol of her strength. She had fought for it, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away. Still, she knew that she couldn't just sit back and relax. This experience had made her realize that there were more people like her, people who needed support and guidance in situations that felt hopeless. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much she had learned about tenant rights, about standing up for herself, and about navigating a system that often didn't seem designed for people like her. In the quiet moments, Selena reflected on the lessons she had learned. She thought about Arthur, the stranger who had come to her with the truth. Without him, she might have never known the full scope of what was happening around her. He had opened her eyes not just to the situation with her landlord, but to the broader issues of exploitation and injustice in the housing system. The more she thought about it, the more she felt a deep desire to do something with this new knowledge. Selene had always wanted to help others, but now she saw a clearer path for how she could make a real difference. The first step was simple. She began talking to her neighbors more. At first, they had all been hesitant, too afraid of the landlord's power to speak up. But now, things were different. People were starting to open up, share their stories, and come together. They started meeting in small groups to discuss their rights, how they could protect themselves, and how they could fight back against unfair treatment. Celine became one of the leaders of these meetings, offering advice and sharing her own experiences. She had never imagined herself in this role, but it felt right. It felt like the next step in her journey. She started researching local tenant rights organizations, looking for ways to get involved. As she connected with these groups, she learned that there were others just like her, people who had been wronged, people who had been too afraid to speak up, people who needed someone to help guide them through the maze of laws and regulations. And that's when Selena knew that she had found her purpose. She wasn't just fighting for her own rights anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for everyone who had ever been pushed to the brink by an unfair system. But even as Selene took on this new role as an advocate, she still had moments of doubt. She wondered if she was really capable of making a difference, or if she was just another person trying to fight a system that was too big and too powerful. Those moments of uncertainty were natural, but they didn't last long. Every time she saw someone stand up for themselves, every time a neighbor came to her with a question or a concern, Celine felt her confidence grow. She realized that she wasn't alone. The strength she had found within herself was mirrored in the strength of the people around her. Together, they were building something bigger than just a fight against one landlord. They were building a community of people who had been overlooked for too long, a community that refused to be ignored. In the quiet moments when she reflected on everything that had happened, Selene couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. The eviction had been painful, no doubt, but it had also been a catalyst for change in her life. It had pushed her out of her comfort zone and into a place where she could not only protect herself, but help others do the same. She had learned that sometimes the hardest things in life, those moments when you feel like everything is falling apart, could lead to something even greater. For Celine, that something was the realization that she had the power to change not just her own life, but the lives of others as well. The more Celine thought about her journey, the more she realized that this experience had shaped her in ways she never expected. The stress, the uncertainty, and the betrayal had all been part of a larger lesson, a lesson about resilience, about standing up for what was right, and about the importance of community. She had started out as someone who was simply trying to survive a terrible situation, but now she saw herself as a leader, someone who could help others avoid the pitfalls she had faced. One afternoon, as she was sitting at her desk organizing a new community meeting for her neighbors, she received a call from her lawyer. The news was both a relief and a reminder that her fight wasn't over yet. The landlord had filed an appeal against the court's decision, trying to reverse the ruling and reinstate the eviction. Selena was taken aback at first. She had thought that the case was closed, that the victory was final. But the reality hit her quickly. Her landlord wasn't giving up easily. It was clear that this was a battle of wills, and Celine knew she had to prepare for whatever came next. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had already been through so much. The legal system could be frustrating, but she wasn't going to back down now. Her lawyer assured her that they had a strong case, and there was no reason to believe the appeal would be successful. Still, the uncertainty hung in the air. The landlord's appeal wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was also a personal attack on Celine. He was trying to regain control of a situation where he had lost, where she had won. But this time, Celine didn't feel the panic she had experienced the first time. Instead, she felt a calm determination settle over her. She knew that she had done everything right. She had followed the law, gathered the evidence, and stood up for herself. She had learned that sometimes the best thing you could do in the face of adversity was to keep moving forward, no matter how many times you were knocked down. In the meantime, Celine continued her work with the tenant group. The meetings grew larger as more and more people in the building began to open up about their own experiences. They shared stories of how they had been treated unfairly, of the rent hikes they had endured, and the promises that had been broken by the landlord. The more Celine heard, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. This was about the entire community that had been living under the thumb of a corrupt landlord. And while she was fighting for her own rights, she now understood that her victory would be a victory for all of them. Celine started making plans for a larger tenant rights initiative. She had learned so much over the past few months, and now she wanted to pass that knowledge on to others. She knew that the more people understood their rights, the less likely they were to be taken advantage of. There was a power in knowledge, and Celine was determined to spread that power. As she worked to organize the next meeting, something shifted inside her. She had always been a private person, someone who kept her struggles to herself, but now she felt compelled to speak out. She wanted to be the voice for those who had been too afraid to speak up before, just as she had once been. Celine knew that her personal fight wasn't over yet, but now she was fighting for something bigger than herself. She was fighting for her neighbors, for the people who had been pushed around by the landlord's cruel tactics for too long. One evening, after a long day of planning, Celine sat on the balcony of her apartment, staring out at the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the buildings. It was a beautiful view, one that always calmed her, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like the calm before the storm. Celine had learned that peace wasn't always the absence of struggle. It was the knowledge that, no matter what happened, she had the strength to face whatever came her way. Just as she was about to head inside, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Arthur, the man who had first shown her the truth about the landlord. His message was simple but important. The landlord is getting desperate. He's starting to reach out to other tenants, trying to make deals with them. It's a sign that he's losing control. Celine's heart raced. This was it. The landlord was feeling the pressure. The walls were closing in on him, and he was trying to save himself by reaching out to those he had wronged. But Celine wasn't worried. She had seen this before. When a person or a system started making desperate moves, it was a sign that they were losing. She knew that this was her moment. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about sending a message to the landlord and anyone else who thought they could walk over people without consequence. Celine wasn't going to let him back down now. She had already come too far, and she knew that victory wasn't just about getting her apartment back. It was about standing firm, about showing everyone who had ever been wronged that they had the power to fight back. With a renewed sense of purpose, Celine set to work on gathering more evidence, reaching out to the group of tenants for support, and preparing for whatever the landlord might throw her way next. She knew the battle was far from over, but now, more than ever, she was ready to see it through to the end. The fight had changed her, but it had also shown her a path she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving, about using her experience to build something better for herself and the community around her. And in that moment, as she stared out at the city skyline, Celine knew that no matter what came next, she would face it with strength, courage, and a commitment to making the world a little bit fairer for everyone. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Celine. The landlord's desperate attempts to regain control of the situation only fueled her determination. He had reached out to a few more tenants, offering to drop the eviction if they signed new, inflated rental agreements. Some tenants, afraid of being pushed out, took the deal, but Celine wasn't one of them. She had learned that standing up for herself wasn't just about resisting the immediate pressure. It was about playing the long game, staying true to what was right, no matter how tempting it might be to take the easy way out. As more tenants signed new leases, Celine began to see the cracks in the landlord's plan. He had underestimated the power of collective action. The more people who resisted, the weaker he became. Celine wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The tenant group had grown stronger, their meetings more frequent, and their resolve more unshakable. Together, they had started pushing for reforms, not just for themselves, but for the entire building. They began advocating for fair rent control policies, demanding that the landlord be held accountable for the illegal tactics he had used to pressure tenants into leaving. But even with the growing support, Celine couldn't shake the feeling that she was still standing on shaky ground. Despite the lawyer's assurances, she knew the legal battle wasn't over. The landlord's appeal was still pending, and the tension weighed heavily on her. Every day, as she walked to work or ran errands, she wondered if today would be the day when the court would rule in his favor. It wasn't just about losing her apartment anymore. It was about the principle. If the landlord won, it would be an injustice not just for her, but for every tenant who had ever felt powerless in the face of greed. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, her phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was from Arthur, the man who had first shown her the truth about the landlord's plans. "Meet me tomorrow," the message said. "I've got something you need to see." Selena's heart raced. Arthur had been a steady presence in her life since that fateful day when he had walked up to her outside her apartment building. He had shown her that there were people who cared, that there was a way out of the nightmare the landlord had created. But what could he possibly have for her now? The next day, Celine met Arthur at a small cafe near the building. He was waiting for her at a corner table, looking as calm and collected as usual. When she sat down, he wasted no time getting to the point. "I've got evidence that the landlord is planning something big," he said, lowering his voice. "I've been doing some digging, and it looks like he's planning to sell the building in the next few months, regardless of the outcome of the legal case." Celine's breath caught in her throat. "Sell the building? What does that mean for us?" she asked, her mind racing with the implications. Arthur nodded, his expression serious. "It means he's going to push every tenant out, even if he has to break the law. He's trying to clear the building so he can sell it to a developer. And the worst part is, he's got connections in City Hall. He's been greasing the right palms to get around tenant protection laws." A surge of anger welled up inside Celine. She had always known the landlord was a crook. But this was something else entirely. The idea that he could push her and her neighbors out for his own profit made her blood boil. But what could she do? The legal battle seemed endless, and the system felt rigged against her. Yet Arthur's words sparked something in her. There had to be a way to stop him. She couldn't let him get away with this, not after everything. Arthur continued, "I've got a contact who works with city officials. If we expose his plan now, before he can execute it, it could be enough to force him into a corner. We might be able to prevent him from selling the building and evicting everyone." The weight of the moment settled on Selene. She had been so focused on the immediate fight that she hadn't seen the larger picture. If the landlord succeeded in selling the building, everything they had fought for would be in vain. It wasn't just about her apartment. It was about the future of everyone who had lived in that building, everyone who had ever been pushed aside for the sake of profit. "Let's do it," Celine said, her voice firm. "Let's expose him, whatever it takes." Arthur smiled, his eyes glinting with approval. "I knew you'd say that." Over the next few days, Celine and Arthur worked tirelessly. They gathered evidence, reached out to tenants for testimonies, and contacted local activists who had been fighting against real estate corruption in the city. It was dangerous. Exposing the landlord's plans could make them targets, but Celine wasn't afraid anymore. She had learned that fear was just a barrier to progress, and if she didn't take this chance now, the people she cared about would pay the price. The next tenant meeting they organized felt different. There was a new energy in the room, an electricity that hadn't been there before. People were ready to fight, not just for their apartments, but for something greater. They weren't just victims anymore. They were warriors for their own future. When the time came to take action, Selene stood in front of the group, feeling stronger than ever. She wasn't the scared woman she had been when she first received the eviction notice. She was a force to be reckoned with. Together, they would expose the landlord's corruption and make sure he could no longer get away with his schemes. The fight was far from over, but Celine knew that with every step forward, they were getting closer to victory. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore. She was fighting for justice, for a future where people like her wouldn't be pushed aside for the greed of others. And she was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. The plan to expose the landlord's schemes moved forward with surprising speed. Celine felt a renewed sense of purpose as she navigated the twists and turns of the fight. The team of tenants she had helped organize was stronger than ever, with people offering their support in various ways. Some provided witness testimonies, others helped gather additional documentation. Everyone had a part to play, and the sense of solidarity was palpable. For the first time since the eviction notice, Celine felt that they were in control. The days that followed were filled with back-to-back meetings, phone calls, and long nights spent preparing the evidence they would present. Arthur had connected them with a journalist from a local news outlet, someone who had experience exposing corrupt landlords and their illegal tactics. The journalist, named Leah, was a firecracker of a woman who had been waiting for an opportunity to take down powerful figures like the landlord. She was fully on board, and her connections to city officials and lawyers helped elevate the group's efforts. The story they were preparing was massive. It wasn't just about one person's eviction. It was about a pattern of exploitation that affected hundreds of tenants across the city. Celine and the others worked around the clock, piecing together documents, digging into the landlord's financial history, and uncovering hidden ties to the city's real estate development boom. They learned that the landlord had been evicting tenants for years, forcing people out with little notice or explanation in order to sell their properties to developers for top dollar. This was the ugly truth they needed to expose. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. One evening, Celine received a threatening message from an unknown number. It was short and to the point. "Stop what you're doing, or you'll regret it." The words were chilling, but Celine wasn't intimidated. She had already come so far. She was no longer afraid of the landlord's empty threats. In fact, the message only fueled her determination to keep going. She forwarded the message to her lawyer, and they made sure to take extra precautions when sharing sensitive information. Celine's focus had shifted from just fighting for her apartment to fighting for the entire building, and maybe even the entire neighborhood. She realized that this wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about standing up for the people who didn't have a voice, the people who had been pushed around by the system. And now, with Arthur, Leah, and the tenants standing beside her, she knew they could make a real difference. The day the story went live, Celine felt a rush of excitement and fear. Leah's article was a scathing exposé, detailing the landlord's illegal evictions, the shady deals he had been making with developers, and his connections to corrupt city officials. It didn't just outline the landlord's wrongdoings, it painted a picture of a system that allowed this kind of behavior to flourish. It was clear that this wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, for the dignity of the people who had been exploited for too long. The article went viral almost immediately. The public response was overwhelming. People were outraged at the landlord's actions, and the story spread like wildfire across social media. Tenants from other buildings began reaching out to Celine, telling their own stories of eviction and mistreatment. The city's housing crisis was laid bare for everyone to see, and suddenly it felt like the world was on their side. For the first time, the landlord was on the defensive. Celine could barely keep up with all the messages, calls, and interviews that followed. Local news stations wanted to interview her and her neighbors. Activists and other tenant groups reached out, offering their support. Celine had become a symbol of resistance, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been wronged by a powerful figure. But even as the attention grew, she remained focused. This wasn't just about the spotlight. It was about the people, the tenants who had been living in fear and silence for so long. They deserved better. The landlord, on the other hand, was scrambling. He had been exposed, and the pressure was mounting. Lawyers began to get involved, and soon, city officials were calling for investigations into his business practices. The tide was turning. The landlord tried to make a deal with Celine, offering her a cash settlement in exchange for dropping the legal action, but Celine wasn't interested. She had come too far to back down now. The fight wasn't just about money, it was about justice. It was about making sure that no one else would have to go through what she had endured. As Celine watched the landlord's empire begin to unravel, she couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The legal battles weren't over, but she had already won. The landlord had lost his grip on the building, and the tenants, once powerless and fearful, now had the strength to stand up and demand their rights. Celine's quiet determination had sparked a movement, and it was only just beginning. In the midst of all this, Celine found herself reflecting on how far she had come. She had started this journey feeling helpless and betrayed, but now she was a leader, a fighter, and a symbol of resilience. The eviction, which had seemed like the end of everything, had turned into the beginning of something greater. She had not only reclaimed her home, but she had also helped give others the tools to reclaim theirs. As she stood in front of the building, looking up at the windows of her apartment, Celine knew that this fight was far from over. The landlord may have been knocked down, but there were many more like him out there, trying to exploit the system for their own gain. But now, Celine had the confidence to continue fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed a voice. And with every step, she knew she was making the world just a little bit more just, one battle at a time. Months passed since the landlord's exposure, and the momentum Celine had built continued to ripple through the community. What started as an individual battle had transformed into something much larger. The building, which had once been filled with tenants living in fear of eviction, was now a symbol of unity and strength. More than a few people had approached Celine, thanking her for standing up for them and giving them the courage to fight their own battles. The transformation in the building was remarkable. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to each other were now collaborating, sharing information and supporting one another. Celine's fight had opened doors she hadn't even considered. She was invited to speak at local housing forums, where she shared her story and explained the importance of tenant rights. She had never thought of herself as an activist, but now she realized it was a role she had stepped into naturally. She had found her voice, and now she was using it to lift up others who had once felt powerless. Her apartment, which had once felt like a prison after the eviction notice, now felt like a sanctuary, a place of peace she had fought for. But Celine wasn't just living for herself anymore. She had built something bigger than her own life. The group of tenants who had once been fractured and fearful was now a force to be reckoned with. They were organizing rent control efforts, rallying against unjust eviction practices, and making sure their voices were heard in city council meetings. Celine had become a pillar of that movement, but she knew that the real power came from the collective effort of everyone involved. She kept in touch with Arthur and Leah, both of whom had become important allies in her ongoing journey. Arthur continued to work behind the scenes, helping other tenants fight their own landlords, while Leah had gone on to write more articles about the housing crisis. Their paths had crossed in an unexpected way, but they had become an integral part of the community that Celine was helping to build. Celine also received regular updates from her lawyer about the landlord's failed attempts to regain control of his properties. The legal battle was ongoing, but it was clear that he had lost his influence in the neighborhood. The press and public opinion had turned against him. The building where Celine had lived, once a piece of property to be sold for profit, was now a symbol of resistance. It stood as a reminder that ordinary people could stand up to the powers that sought to oppress them. One evening, as Selena was sitting in her living room, sipping tea and reflecting on everything that had happened, her phone buzzed with a message from Arthur. It was simple but powerful. The landlord has officially sold the building to a non-profit developer. They're going to keep rents affordable and ensure all the tenants stay in their homes. Celine's heart swelled with relief and pride. This was the moment she had been working for. The victory wasn't just personal anymore. It was a triumph for everyone who had been treated unfairly. The non-profit developer wasn't just interested in profit. They were interested in community, in people, in providing affordable housing for those who needed it most. The landlord's corrupt plan to evict and sell had been thwarted, not by the system, but by the very people he had underestimated. That evening, Celine felt a deep sense of closure. The fight she had started, that small spark of resistance, had grown into something much more than she had ever imagined. But even more than that, she had found a purpose. She had discovered that her voice mattered, that standing up for what was right could change lives. The journey had been long and hard, but it had taught her something invaluable. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't in getting back at the ones who wronged you, but in becoming stronger, wiser, and more resilient than they ever expected. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Celine continued her work with the tenant group. She helped organize community events, spoke out about the importance of fair housing, and made sure that no one in her building or in her city ever had to feel as helpless as she once had. She had turned a moment of betrayal into a movement of empowerment. The building, her community, and her life were better for it. Celine knew that the world wasn't perfect. There would always be landlords, like the one who tried to take everything from her. But she also knew that the power to change things was within the hands of people who refused to stay silent. And as long as there were people like her, willing to fight for what was right, there would always be hope. One day, as she looked out of her window, watching the sunset over the city, Selena smiled. She had been through so much, but she had come out the other side stronger and more determined. She had reclaimed not just her home, but her sense of self, her power, and her future. And she knew that, no matter what came next, she would face it with the same courage and strength that had brought her this far. The battle for justice wasn't over, but Celine was ready to keep fighting, one step at a time.